there's a quote that I like from Peter Drucker. It says, a profit for a business is like air for a human being. If you don't get enough of it, you're out of the game. But if you think your life is about breathing, you're really missing something. So, it's given that you need to be profitable, but beyond that, what difference are you making? That's what people care about ultimately. At the end of the day, at the end of your career, you look back like, how did I make people's lives better? And it doesn't need to be saving the whales per se, even though
Mhm.
that's a noble cause, but it could be just in small incremental ways. It's a great place to work. Is a good place to start. Your
Mhm.
employees loved working there. You had a sense of purpose and camaraderie. You had deep relationships, rewarding relationships, and you made a difference on the lives of all your stakeholders.
Scaling a business shouldn't mean doing everything yourself. And today's guest helps leaders finally stop being the bottleneck. Welcome back to the Perpetual Growth Podcast, the show where we uncover the strategies, stories, and systems that fuel holistic growth in business, leadership, and life. I'm your host, Zach Palmer, and today I'm joined by someone who's mastered the art of operational clarity, Mark Scrimenti. Mark is the founder of Vivid Path and a fractional COO who helps founder led companies transform chaos into clarity. He partners with B2B businesses between 5 and 50 million in revenue to align leadership, simplify systems, and build values driven cultures that scale with purpose. If you've ever felt like your business depends too much on you, or like your systems are cracking under the weight of growth, this conversation will be your North Star. Mark, welcome to the Perpetual Growth Podcast.
Thanks, Zach. It's great to be here. Excited to
Yeah,
talk.
I'm excited to have you. Well, Mark, I always like to start with this question because I think it reveals a lot about who someone really is. What does growth mean to you right now in this season of your life?
Mm, that's a great question. There's multiple fronts. Growth is always stepping out of your comfort zone. And to me, it's always involved learning. I love to learn. I've been a very curious person, so continuing to learn. Continued mastery, I would say. I think mastery is a process. I don't think you ever quite get there. Kind of like Zeno's paradox. You get closer and closer and closer, but you never quite get there.
Hmm.
And I like it that way because it keeps life interesting. There's always a challenge ahead of you, something else to do, something else to learn.
Yeah.
It different fronts, financial growth, business growth. What do I want to do with my business to scale it? I'm helping other people scale their businesses, and sometimes there can be the shoemaker's kids thing. Like, what about myself? Like, how am I going to do that for myself?
Right.
And I've got thoughts about that as well.
Yeah.
But I'm a holistic thinker by nature and a systems thinker. So I'm thinking about my whole life as a whole and my personal life, my satisfaction, what gives me a sense of reward in working with other people, which is really um, being purposeful and making a human impact. Ultimately, the money part, you know, there's a quote that I like from Peter Drucker. It says, a profit for a business is like air for a human being. If you don't get enough of it, you're out of the game. But if you think your life is about breathing, you're really missing something. So, it's given that you need to be profitable, but beyond that, what difference are you making? That's what people care about ultimately. At the end of the day, at the end of your career, you look back like, how did I make people's lives better? And it doesn't need to be saving the whales per se, even though
Mhm.
that's a noble cause, but it could be just in small incremental ways. It's a great place to work. Is a good place to start. Your
Mhm.
employees loved working there. You had a sense of purpose and camaraderie. You had deep relationships, rewarding relationships, and you made a difference on the lives of all your stakeholders.
Mhm. That's a beautiful answer. I love your thoughts there. It's interesting too because systems, at least in my experience, seem to be one of the things that so many companies neglect. They sweep under the rug. There's so much stuff that gets caught in our heads, and the irony is the value of systems is designed to make your life easier. It's designed to take the stuff out of your head, to automate the stuff you don't need to be doing on a consistent basis. And one thing you talked about that I found really interesting too is, the evolution of growth, right?
Hmm.
And we're constantly learning and like, what is it, 10,000 hours to mastery or something along those
Hmm.
lines. But to your point, um, on what playing field? Because it's always evolving. Like if we just take current times, and I would love your perspective on this, we are on the era of AI. So operational infrastructures, 10 years ago look a lot different than they do now. or at least our ability to build and design and implement them, and dramatically different from 30 years ago. So,
Mhm.
relative to growth and mastery, maybe let's talk on that subject a little bit. Like, where are you seeing AI become a really advantageous tool as it pertains to operational landscape? How are you leveraging it? Are you having to, persuade your clients the value, or are you finally hitting that kind of tipping point where people are more open-minded, but still maybe a little fearful? Like, what are you seeing in your arena?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's something I've been thinking about a lot lately. Everybody's thinking about AI and everyone's dabbling in it. Typically, kind of nipping around the edges. The types of tools. Everyone's using ChatGPT or a note transcriber. I mean, if you're not, you should be.
Yeah.
But those just will kind of incrementally improve your efficiency and your productivity in the best case scenario. But there aren't that many tools out there that are like holistically about business transformation, starting
Hmm.
from the business strategy out. Now, I have started partnering with somebody who has such a platform. I could talk about it a little bit today, but where we're really looking, it's an AI architecture that, it's built from the ground up, leveraging all the knowledge you can possibly have about your customers. I mean, that's transactional data, everything from your CRM, from your customer logs, for example, everything that's available on the internet, and social media, on community sites, Reddit and things like that, as well as device data, behavioral data. That's your ground floor, and then each section of the customer journey, you've got like an agentic AI, and then you've got a layer predictive, generative, predictive AI, that's looking to optimize your message. To the customer at every step of the customer journey, in order to create category dominance. So if you hit them first, you know, chances are you stand a much stronger chance of winning their business. If you hit them on like 40% of the touch points, you end up getting 90% of the business typically. And how do you do that throughout each stage and do that in a way that you're constantly learning? That's what AI can enable now. Because I'm always talking about systems, and when we talk about systems thinking, you want to be learning, and we talked about like the lean startup. I love the lean startup, the idea that, of um, verified learning, validated learning. That's kind of your currency in the beginning when you're starting up, even if you're not making revenue. Are you learning something? As long as you're learning something, it's valuable. And as long as you're adapting and applying what you've learned, those insights, and changing as a result, that's good. You're growing. And so that's what AI can help us do so much faster than before if we apply it correctly. So I think to answer your question, that's sort of a broad answer with some tangents there, but specifically, everyone's chasing it, and everyone has a sense that if I don't adopt AI soon, I'm going to be left in the dust, and that's probably true. But my most people that I've worked with, most businesses aren't really fully taking advantage of it. And we also
Hmm.
know that a lot of AI projects are failing. So, and I'm talking about the small to mid market. With the
Hmm.
big enterprise companies, they've got way more resources and time and money to figure out, you know, how it's going to work for them. But small to
Hmm.
medium sized businesses have yet to generally really capitalize it in the way that it promises. I think it's a matter of time, though, and it's also a
Hmm.
matter of thinking, though, and mindset and being adaptive. The other thing I'll add to that, which I think is related, is business model adaptability. This idea that, you know, um, I just did a blog post about this, but so it's top of mind right now. But the idea that people think about product market fit, you get the product market fit, and then you just optimize that product forever. It's like, well, no, the market changes, people's tastes changes, people's needs change. So you need to be constantly reinventing yourself, and you need to have an infrastructure, an operational infrastructure that's flexible enough to do that. And you have to have those feedback loops built in order to do that. It can't be static. It has to be dynamic.
Hmm. Yeah, wholeheartedly agree. I mean, it's not only systems and operations not only enhance or support your ability to grow and scale, they're also, in my mind's eye, one of the foundational pillars to what makes a business, what makes it a saleable product. I mean, if everything is in your head,
Right.
then you don't have a business, you have a job.
Exactly.
So, operational infrastructures are of paramount importance. And what I love that you said, and we're implying too, and I think we tend to think maybe either too globally or get too fixated on the minutia, but operations is a necessary component for every aspect and department within your
Right.
organization.
Yeah.
Leadership, operations, sales, marketing, customer experience. And you talk about the customer journey and this new AI software, and it can pull from the data sets in your CRM and the internet. I know you're working with most often with companies that are doing 5 to 10 million in revenue. So what that tells me is, at least if they're doing things well, they've probably got at least a fair amount of raw data that they can put into those systems, and in many cases probably a fairly substantial amount, and a lot
Mhm.
more value than they might even recognize. What about a smaller company or startup that doesn't necessarily have the data yet? Would that software still be able to scrape enough information on the internet, or do you have to have a large enough customer base to be able to aggregate and really for it to be able to properly discern, what those appropriate interactions are going to be at each stage of the journey? What does that look
Yeah.
like?
I think that's a good question. I mean, I think you could start with very little internal data because there's still plenty of data, behavioral data, device data, data out there on the internet, profiling data, MBTI type stuff, where you can at least get a good guess, even if it's, just like any information, it's going to be incomplete, but you start with let's say an eight, you talked about 80/20, like an 80%
Mhm.
guess. And maybe it gets you close, and maybe you're a little bit off base, but you keep learning from that and refining. So you're building that data all the time. And I don't think I don't think you have to wait to start that. I don't think you can start that too soon, essentially.
Mhm.
With sparser data, again, it's going to be a vaguer hypothesis that you're starting with, but you keep refining it over time, ideally, and you're capturing the data along the way and building a more robust profile, for
Mhm.
example, of a customer.
Yeah, yeah, no, that's beautiful. I mean, and data is paramount to the success of any business. I mean, better quality of the data, the better the quality question that we can ask, and ultimately the better answer that we will get.
Right.
I'm curious if there's anything that's shown up in your work, because I know that from my experience working with clients in, whether it's a startup or organization of $3 to 10 million range or 100 million plus, new level, new devil, different
Hmm.
stage of business, different problems that are common patterns to that stage. So
Right.
getting to 5 million, it's a different, set of challenges, different way of thinking, different problems you're going to have at 15, 25, and 50 million. What are some of the common patterns that you've identified, particularly in the way of lack, where
Hmm.
these organizations at various stages have been short-sighted and they could be leveraging the power of anticipation that you're implying, start building that infrastructure now. I mean, there's
Right.
reactivity, particularly in business, is going to be significantly more costly than proactivity and setting up the right infrastructure. So, are there any, common challenges that come to mind at various stages that people could start focusing on, and maybe questions they could or should be asking themselves right now?
Yeah, that's a great question. But first of all, I'm thinking about something that you said before about how there's
Hmm.
operations and everything,
Hmm.
and that's how I think as well as holistically, and my own framework was sort of a framework of frameworks is called whole operations because I think of it as a piece. They all have to work together. So to your point, I mean, there's different parts of the operation that you need to shore up at different stages, typically. I mean, if you don't have revenue, for example, then, work focusing on back office stuff, doesn't really make sense.
Right.
Although I've seen, the opposite problem too, where people are selling like crazy and they just don't have the operational infrastructure to support it. So, like in a B2B professional services context, they're churning clients because they can't
Hmm.
keep up with it, and their reputation ultimately sinks because of it.
Yeah.
But I think early on, the smaller companies, 1 to 2 million, um, maybe as much as 5 million, often you're just missing some fundamental pieces. You may not everybody have the right people in the right seats. You may not have all the right people yet. Org structure can be very common. I mean, that could be at any level, really, but where
Hmm.
your org structure doesn't really align with your business model, or people are doing, let's say you've been around for 10 years, you're making money, but you got some of the same people you've had for a while, and you just can't get over the hump. Like whatever got you there isn't going to get you where I want to go next, which is
Mm.
typically, that's one inflection point where people might call me in, and that's usually at the smaller end, 1 to 2 million. And people are doing 5 different jobs without really realizing it. That's just my job, and
Yeah.
you've got 5 hats, and you have to really identify that, clarify that it's no really 5 jobs, and maybe this one you shouldn't be doing anymore. Maybe this one we don't even need to do anymore, or this one we could automate, or this one we could outsource, or maybe you need to do these 3 for now, but ideally this one is really where you're gifted and golden. And we're going to need more of that as we grow. Here's how you can help us grow. And as we do, we're going to see that role enlarge for you. And I'm really big on aligning, employees' personal roadmaps, career aspirations, goals, with the company's strategic roadmap for growth. And because if you can grow together, you can keep your best people for the long term. Alternatively, you lose your best people at it, if you can't keep them growing, if they're interested in growing. And they also need to want to grow and grow with you. Otherwise, you will outgrow them. I've seen that happen as well. So the founder CEO is often way too involved in day-to-day operation, talk about wearing hats, like wearing
You just
16
read my
hats.
mind.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
And understandably, typically hard, uh, it's difficult for them to let go. They don't feel they can trust their team to take on certain responsibilities, and it's not necessarily a problem with the team. It can be in some cases, but it's typically process and having that supporting structure. So one of the things I like to do is start with a strategic roadmap if they don't have one. And there's a framework that I work with. It's called System and Soul. It's a business operating system. I love it because it's flexible, it's dynamic, it's open source, and
Mhm.
it balances the structural components of operations like systems, processes, metrics with the people side of the business. Vision, values, purpose, employee leadership development, and so forth. And it treats them equally. You need to operationalize those as well. Those softer, intangibles. And so you come up with a roadmap that's like, here's where we want to go in, by whenever, in 10 years. Here's our differentiator. Here's like the playing space. You define your playing space to differentiator within that space. Your big, hairy, audacious goal, what we want to do, in 10 years. And here's why, like the purpose. That's a big part of it. Again, like what human
Mhm.
impact do you want to make? Because nobody really cares about your bottom line when it comes
Mhm.
down to it. I mean, it may make a difference in their lives if you're getting bonused and they're, so forth. They need to understand that. But
Mhm.
but on the other hand, that's not what really drives people or motivates them or inspires them. Like, how are we changing the world? How is the
Yeah.
world going to look different when we achieve our next goal, our next
Mhm.
milestone? That's important. We look at hedgehog concept, if you're familiar with that, from Jim
Mhm.
Collins. Like, what are you most
Mhm.
passionate about? What can be best at in the world? And drives your economic engine, which is a key metric. It might be customer lifetime value. It might be number of people in our network and so forth. But then we go down to objectives and key results, and like, okay, if you want to be there in 10 years, 3 years, 1 year, next quarter, what are your top priorities? And we define them as objectives and key results. This is our goal. And then these are the measurable things, we're gonna do to know that we got there. And that's kind of an art too, because the way you define the goal and the way you find the key results, sometimes you hit all the key results, you're like, wait, but I don't think we really achieved this objective. That means you didn't define it quite right. And that's okay. You're making
Mhm.
progress, but it's an iterative thing. And
Mhm.
I like I like iteration. Let's start. This is also hard for founder CEOs to get pinned down on a piece of paper. So I don't even pin down. Like I got too many ideas. It's like, no, it's a starting point. Let's start with a shitty first draft. So I always reassure them we can always come back and change it, and you'll need to anyway, and you
Yeah.
should,
Yeah.
but on a regular basis. But it'll get us started. And what this does is allows your leadership team to take ownership of growth initiatives, and it's the beginning of the founder CEO letting go because, okay, we are all on the same page. We've all agreed on this. We've come up with this together. We know the intent, like the commander's intent, and I can start to let go of the reins and let this person drive that growth initiative. You build in guardrails and alignment processes, like the weekly meetings where you're giving each other updates and you're solving problems together to make sure that things stay on track. But eventually, um, the other leaders on the team can drive growth without the founder CEO being there, and then that person is freed up to do whatever they do best. And
Hmm.
there's a big culture piece in that too. The other piece, quickly, sorry, because I've been
Oh,
talking
no, keep
at
going,
you,
please.
is figuring out, what kind of culture do we want to have? What kind of culture do we need to have, to attract and retain the people we're going to need to be successful in our mission? And let's define those characteristics. It could be the characteristics you would hope to read about yourself on Glassdoor. Like, oh, all my best employees are saying this about us. Okay, great. Okay. And then let's go back to your core values, and whether you have them or not. So let's define them. And they need to be more than mere table stakes, and they need to be meaningful and distinctive to you. Sometimes we use, phrases like everybody makes the coffee. That's one that I like because you kind of know what
Hmm.
that means.
Hmm.
And then the middle piece, which is really key, a lot of people miss this, is organizational habits. Like what organizational habits do we cultivate and adopt to bring those core values to life, to really operationalize them, to create that kind of culture that we want to create to, attract and retain our best people long term and keep them healthy and growing and not burn them out and so forth. And so that too is an iterative process, but you do it together as a team and then you all agree on it and you keep reinforcing that over and over again. It's like gardening, you water the stuff you want and you pull the weeds that you don't
Hmm.
want.
Oh, that's beautiful. There's so many takeaways that I have from this conversation you just shared. Oh, the question I was asking myself in my mind is there a who is the most common bottleneck? And what I heard you say several times was owner, founder, CEO.
Right.
And I find it so fascinating because, you know, my personal experience has been exactly the same thing. I think it's probably been most people's. But you also talked a lot about many of the dynamics to shift that. And one thing you said is one of the challenges is owners tend to think, well, I know all this stuff and nobody's going to do it as effectively as me.
Mhm.
And they're 100% right, particularly if you aren't taking the active steps to train the person and share what you know. I mean, that's
Right.
part of what leadership entails is helping the people around us to grow and level up and achieve their next level skill set, fulfillment, everything.
Mhm.
So I like how one thing that's so fascinating, I'm starting to notice a theme in the most successful consultants, and it models a lot of what I do when I'm working with an organization and working on implementation is it's never just sales for me, right?
Yeah.
It's a combination of leadership and sales and product and fulfillment strategies and the customer journey. I mean, yeah, sales is the inception point, but if we're not taking a hard look at leadership and those foundational pieces that you're talking about, mission, vision, values, culture, character, how are we showing up? What do
Mhm.
we embody? What does it mean to be a part of this team and organization? What is the big, hairy, audacious goal that we're solving? And then how do we operate as a cohesive unit on a day-to-day basis? And how does that impact the culture? Because it's not just the systems.
Right.
It's
Right.
everything with how we show up in a more holistic look. And I love your take, perspective, insights on that because I don't think it's something that's discussed often enough and does have a tremendous impact on the organization. Um, I'm curious and this is a pretty specific question, but I'm sure you may have additional insights on it. One thing I'd never thought about is, we typically think about employee churn as it relates
Mhm.
to usually it's like a lack of fulfillment. I mean, I think fundamentally, a lot of what it comes down to is a lack of fulfillment. People aren't being used
Mhm.
at their fullest capacities. And sometimes
Right.
you're not fit for the culture and things like that. But another aspect of operations how can operations help solve some of the things that do degrade your overall fulfillment within an organization? Because I have to imagine that's from a qualitative standpoint, something that at least I wouldn't imagine it's quantitative, but maybe it is. From a qualitative standpoint, if you're making people's lives easier,
Mhm.
they're going to enjoy working more because now they get to focus more on their zone of genius, not just the tasks that they have to execute in order to be able to get to that zone, if that makes sense.
Right. Right. Yeah. And that's a good question. I think it depends on how you're understanding operations, and
Hmm.
so I take a broad view of operations, as I mentioned, and sounds like you do as well, that knowing that there's operations in every component of the business. And the
Mhm.
businesses that I work with, typically, they may not have an HR department, for example. So,
Mm.
so I'm it if I'm a fractional, or the operations person or the COO or whoever the lead is might be that person in a sense. So um,
Oh.
that's important because um, for example, what I do is make sure that people are talking to each other on a regular basis. So there's the strategic meetings that you have with your leadership team, and that's, weekly meeting, 60, 90 minutes, where you're checking in on progress and problem solving together. But there's also the
Hmm.
one-on-ones that you need to be having with your employees for alignment. There's, regular alignment cycles every day. And that's where you're having those conversations about career. And it might be once a quarter that you revisit this roadmap, but it could be more frequently than that, where you're keeping it in mind. And it's certainly annually. So like annual review process, that's another thing. How do you handle that? How do you handle feedback? Now, ideally, you're not doing it just annually or quarterly. Like you're having regular conversations, and then really, coaching people to have in those conversations to go deep, to get to know your people personally and professionally, to really understand them. And that takes vulnerability. It takes active listening, vulnerability. So these are more like coachable skills. And I think many of them are coachable. So you might say, well, I'm not good at that, and some people are better than others, naturally. But I think they can be coached to a point of sufficiency in most cases. And sometimes, the common problem where people get promoted because they're a great technician. They're great at what they do, and the only path for growth is to become a manager. But now you take somebody who's really good, like a good engineer, for example, and make them a manager. They're a bad manager, and you lose a good engineer, and you may lose more good engineers because they're not a good manager. So that happens a lot. So part of it is having other growth paths, that, whether finding out what really motivates people. So, what kind of compensation is another model that we use in System and Soul. It's the six dimensions of compensation. And there's the psychological compensation, social, what they call spiritual, which is really like purpose, meaning, physical. Do you have flexibility in your job? Do you have the materials you need, the resources you need? Can you take time off if you need to be with your family? Can you work from home? And then there's, there's financial as well, and that's always important, but it's not necessarily the most important thing for everybody all the time. As you said, the
Hmm.
relationship with their manager, of course, that's a big one. And so figuring out what motivates people and making sure to, feed them that as much as you can, as they earn it, as they
Hmm.
demonstrate um, their commitment and they earn it. You try and provide that. So having different paths for growth. We had a lot of success. I can give you an example.
Hmm.
I was in online retail for 12 years, and we sold musical instruments. You see a bass, an old bass back there.
Hmm.
And we had a call center, and this was the day job for a lot of young musicians just coming out of many of them were coming out of college, and they were gigging at night and pursuing their rock and roll dream or hip hop dream, whatever it may be. And but they had a lot of other talents too, and so in the process we got to know them and figure out who was good at what. And people ended up in different parts of the company. Some people became programmers, some people became QA, marketing, data analytics, and so forth. We did all our digital marketing in-house, so we had opportunities for them. And some of those people are still there, like 10,
Hmm.
15 years later. They found a career there. So if you're growing and if you're talking to people, really getting to know them, you can find their gifts and nurture them. And if it involves training, then it involves training. Like it's worth the investment. Um, Sometimes you have to bring in people from the outside, but if you can grow your own, I think that can be even better, especially, I mean, if you start with a good cultural fit. So I think of these as operational things. I mean, to your point, just these little things that drive you crazy every day because they're unnecessary, like this needless repetition or this inefficient process. Those are sort of the easier fixes. But bigger picture, I think it's more of this kind of stuff, having to do with culture and the employee experience, which I think is equally important as the customer experience. I think of them as sort of a continuum. Like how you
Hmm.
treat your employees is how they're going to treat your customers or your clients, and you want to
Hmm.
model that at home first. It's a
Hmm.
we do first kind of thing. I wouldn't expect you to do what I don't do, for you, um,
Hmm.
to our clients. So that's just my personal philosophy.
No, I think that's really interesting. I'm going to come full circle of that in just a second. One thing I'd love to share with the audience, if you guys are getting value from this conversation with Mark, a quick invitation, just hit that follow button so you never miss an episode. We got more conversations coming your way with powerhouse founders, consultants, and industry leaders just like this. So don't miss an opportunity. And Mark, I love what you were saying because again, what I find so interesting is this evolution and fusion of leadership and now to refine that even further HR into your operations practice. And I'm curious, I mean, I know that companies are legally required when they have 50 or more employees to implement HR. And
Mhm.
HR is also somewhat of a nebulous conversation topic. I mean, a lot of people are really unaware of what the functions of HR and um, uh, what it actually does for the organization. And I think in many cases, it's like a box that's being checked as a necessity, not something that is perceived as true value additions. And everything
Right.
that you just illustrated showcases a tremendous amount of value in it. And I'm curious for you from your perspective, you mentioned that in many cases in this role as a fractional COO, you are wearing the duality of both hats, which is a massive undertaking.
Mhm.
Um, at what stage are you finding is there a revenue benchmark? I mean, we know the requirement
Mhm.
by the government 50 plus, but
Yeah.
at what stage is it most common, or maybe there's problems or success milestones? There's a pattern, I'm sure, somewhere in there where it makes sense to one, um, start conditioning the COO to take on some of these HR dependent roles because maybe they're not
Mhm.
quite ready for an HR professional. And at what
Mhm.
stage are they ready to bring on an HR pro? Because at the same time, there's multiple levels of HR from an entry level advisor, I believe they're referred to as, to your senior HR executives. Um, if you could talk a little bit about that, so people have some of those again, so we can leverage the power of anticipation and they can start looking
Mhm.
forward as to when they might need to leverage these things and when it's time to call you for the same reason.
Right, right. That's a great question. I think like I worked for a company where the founder really didn't want to have HR. I don't know. He was sort of opposed to that. Um, am I sorry?
It's a
Am
little
I
bit, but I can still hear you fine. You're
delayed?
okay.
Yeah. Okay.
Hmm. Hmm.
Okay. Kind of opposed to that standardization or whatever. But I mean, certainly there's, like you said, 50 people, legal requirements, compliance requirements, and that's really important. Having a handbook that's compliant and that's, meaningful, that's useful.
Hmm.
When you start having benefits, for example, that's important. I think the more systematic you are about annual reviews and, tying compensation to annual reviews, bonuses, 401k, anytime, you're bringing in more benefits into the organization, having an HR expert, you could have a consultant, consult, uh, to create your handbook, for example, or to create your benefits package, or to review your policies and procedures and to see if they are compliant.
I want to peel back the onion on just on one of those exactly because I mean, look, even at benefits packages, if I'm
Yeah.
not mistaken, um, we have a fiduciary responsibility as the person, as the owner of an organization to provide the best choice in the benefit package at the lowest possible expense. And I don't remember exactly how it's worded, but I remember working loosely with another HR professional and her having said something to those to that event. So I mean, it's not just like, hey, here's some benefits, throw them at them. Do you oftentimes work with PEOs to help put those packages together because they have such a plethora of options and really can customize it to the organization's needs? Is something where you're familiar and adept and it's relatively easy to implement? And maybe you could talk a little bit about and help clarify that our real responsibility because it's not just something we're giving and it's not just
Right.
something we're required to do. I mean, it is, but how can we think past that?
Right, right. I mean, I think this is where you would bring in an HR expert. I am aware. I've never actually worked with a company that's using a PEO, but I'm definitely aware of PEOs and PEO brokers. And PEO brokers can be a good way to go. And I happen to know a really good one. So they have relationships with all the PEOs, and they can find the best deal for you. Because they all have, different things to offer, and you may not need everything that the PEO has to offer and the way it's packaged. So, talking to a broker is a good way to go. Um, that does imply a certain, revenue typical milestone, typically a revenue milestone, and a size milestone in terms of employees, which is going to differ by industry.
Mhm.
But um, uh, I'm sorry, what was I think I lost your question in that.
I think I did too. I got too hyper focused and fixated. Um, what was my exact original question? Uh, well, it was just thinking about HR implementation, if and when you bring on a PEO, when it's okay to self-identify, the importance of, making sure that you are thinking also beyond this is something that I have to do, I'm
Right.
required to do, but really thinking forward to how can I do this in a way that is providing extra value to my organization. Because I think this is again another one of these conversations that is so often overlooked. Is it's like HR is something I have to put in place, but what people don't
Right.
realize is a properly implemented HR infrastructure creates just as much value as any other piece of the organization by
Yeah.
helping to
Yeah.
reduce churn and create the better experience and create the
Exactly.
culture and everything.
What one thing, one example I can give is at
Yeah.
the music company, at the online retailer. We brought in an HR person when we were seeing a lot of churn, and
Mm.
it was also affecting our unemployment insurance. There's an unemployment insurance rate, and if you hit a certain every 3 years, it gets renewed. This is in Illinois anyway, and it went from 2 to 10%, so a huge jump. Because the year before I took over that role of directing the call center, we lost 100% of our people. I mean, we not 100% of people, we had 100% turnover. We hired 30 and lost 31, just an insane number. So it's like,
Wow.
how do we turn this around? And a lot of those people were going on unemployment too. So, it's kind of a negative perspective on it, but like from just a pure like cost standpoint to the business, like, turnover is costly. That's one example of how it's costly. It's also costly in terms of, you know, hiring people, the cost, and people underestimate that all the time. They underestimate the cost of finding. It's like customer acquisition,
Yeah,
um,
exactly.
versus, selling to somebody already, who's already a customer. So we brought in an HR person to help standardize. We had a discipline policy, because there were people who ended up going on. This is not my favorite example to emphasize, but there are people who ended up going on unemployment who, really they
It's okay. You
you
can
know
say
they
it.
probably didn't deserve to be on it.
Right.
They didn't do a good job. I mean, they're
Hmm.
entitled to it, but the point is that you can only challenge it if you check your boxes, and we weren't checking the boxes. We're very loose about that, and so if you do, the one warning, the written warning, so forth, then, and under the right circumstances, like they're going to be denied, like if they steal from you or whatever, um, and but you have to check the boxes. So that was one thing that she helped with. She also helped with the employee manual, and rewriting it, from scratch and really making it robust. And then benefits too, same thing. We started expanding our benefits and getting into more training opportunities. And if you want somebody to manage that budget and to create a budget for it, um, I mean, I love working with good HR people. To me, it's a luxury. I would much rather bring one in sooner rather than later. It's just that certain employers or CEOs just don't see the value of it, or they're resistant to it for whatever. They're going to make me do stuff I don't want to do. Um, and if you're like a libertarian mindset or something, it's like I don't want to, it smacks of bureaucracy or something. I don't know what it is. But I think a good HR person is gold, and we would work hand in hand. And some of this stuff I'm doing because it's a small enough company that I have a relationship with everybody. But when you get to a certain size, that's no longer possible, and you need somebody to ensure that people are having the right conversations and in the right way, and everything else.
Yeah, no, very, very thoughtful and insightful, and I wholeheartedly agree. Before we wrap up today, Mark, I want to ask you something that we don't always get to on the show. You talk a lot about aligning operations with values and culture.
Mhm.
What's one practice or perspective shift that leaders can adopt today to immediately build more trust and cohesion inside the organization? And whether it's a tactical or mindset based, give us something
Mhm.
real that our audience can start doing right now. I heard from you earlier, start building relationships. Is there something a little bit more tactical and strategic, or something else that comes to mind that could enhance those practices even further?
Yeah, I mean there are frameworks for that. There's frameworks for everything. Crucial Conversations, is a great book. Or trying to think what else. Um, I have a client, for example, who adopted a framework. It's an agency, and they're growing. They're doing very well. They're talented, but the founder CEO had this feeling like we're just too nice with each other. We need to be, if we want to grow, we need to be more critical. And I said, well, do you think people are too thin-skinned, to handle it? She said, no. He said, so we just don't want to hurt anybody else's feelings. So they used it's not Crucial Conversations, but it's the other Radical Candor, the
Mhm.
book, you know, um, with some additional insights from Brene Brown to create a framework for delivering feedback. And it's like you name what you like about it, you name what you think could be better, and maybe you offer a suggestion. And it's on both sides. It's delivering the feedback and it's receiving the feedback. And people it's helped, and it's created. It's still a work in progress where they're learning how to do this more effectively, but people often think they're being more direct than they really are. Like I was really kind of harsh in that meeting. It's like, no, you weren't. Like nobody else picked up on that. It's because you're sensitive and you don't want to hurt anybody's feelings, which is not a bad thing. But you have to realize you're going to need to be more direct. It might feel uncomfortable for you to deliver more direct feedback. And so let's practice that together. So you can be very deliberate about it. And there are consultants, I mean, I coach people on this kind of stuff, but there are also consultants that specialize in that. I know somebody who specializes in radical candor and will do workshops for the team. That's one example. I think also in the framework that I use, System and Soul, when we do these planning meetings, we're having some pretty uh, critical conversations. Like, do we have the right people in the right seats? We're all in the room. Let's talk about it. Like, nobody's going to raise their hand typically and say, "I'm in the wrong seat," but you have to surface that information in a way that's constructive and limits collateral damage. And again, it's going to be the CEO, and that is a little bit easier. It can be harder, but also a little bit easier because they're the most powerful person in the company, so they should be able to take it, right? And everybody knows that's kind of the elephant in the room anyway. Hopefully, they have that awareness to say, like, I know I am the bottleneck. But you need to be able to talk about it, and you need to be able to talk about uh, what you feel uncomfortable with. Like I'm not comfortable handing this off to you because what, and so these are the kind of conversations I can help facilitate. And I think once you practice them and you start having these weekly meetings where this is what you do in the meeting, you spend 45 minutes out of an hour problem solving, and you've got a list of an issues and the opportunities list. It's all the stuff. It's working on the business versus working in the business. It's all the lingering stuff you keep. It's like a backlog that you keep, and then you go in there and you prioritize it. What's our top three issues? And you agree on it. It's a consensus thing, and then you tackle them one by one. And if you only get through one, but you actually get through it, that's great. That's a success because if you prioritize them correctly, like that was a big issue and you just solved it, then you got to follow through, of course. But and you just keep doing that, week after week, and you develop those muscles of doing confrontation well, or confrontation conflict, it's resolving conflict, solving problems. Um, Again, it takes somebody who's willing to change, to step in that place of discomfort. I think the leader needs to go first. Your leaders always go first. You got to be vulnerable. The leader needs to be vulnerable. The leader needs to say, look, I know that I'm, so that requires self-awareness, it requires some humility, it requires courage. I know I made a mistake here, or I'm not that good at this, or I'd like to be better at this. Um, I need, here's what I can do to help support you. But, it's also a two-way conversation. And
Mhm.
again, lots of frameworks for making that happen, and it helps to have a facilitator at least to begin with. But ultimately, you learn how to do it yourself, and you don't need the facilitator anymore.
Yeah, yeah. There's several takeaways. I'm gonna recap some really critical insights from what you just said and throughout this conversation. Just before I do, I mean, as you were talking about, leaders, and we're sitting around the table, and one of the leading questions could be something along the lines of, "Do we have all the right butts in the right seats?" It
Mhm.
resonates with me on a high level because in one of my earlier roles, there was two of us in the same position, and obviously, it doesn't make sense to have two leaders in the same swim lane. So we all agreed we needed to divide and conquer. At the time, I was positioned to take one particular role, and they just kept telling me, "You're good at it. This is what you're good at. This is what you, man, we can see this in everything that you do." And I reluctantly agreed. And I remember that internal voice, the intuition saying, "No, you're meant to be in that spot."
Mhm.
And lo and behold, what happens, because I didn't trust my intuition, I didn't speak up for myself in the moment, I
Mhm.
followed the path of agreement. It was just this slow degrade where I felt like my life was wasting away. And I created an environment where I didn't know at the time, but I began to self-sabotage.
Yeah.
And I think it's so important to start having those hard conversations sooner than later, and have that willingness to speak up on your behalf, on behalf of the team, the employees, and create an environment where what I call creative friction
Mhm.
is a part of the norm. It's
Right.
it's making it a normal part of our culture, because those are the things that wash away resentment and allow us to create alignment and step into the best version of ourselves and really create a much more fulfilling workplace. So I love what you said. That makes complete sense to me. And some of my other big takeaways for you, operations is not just operations, it's also leadership. Like, it's more than
Mhm.
systems, it's people, it's culture, it's training. And,
Right.
ironically, leaders, maybe not so much, are the most common bottleneck. And
Right.
because of that, they need to be the first ones that step in and take ownership of implementation of operations HR, but also showcasing what I believe is a superpower, which is vulnerability,
Right.
because people are going to model, as you mentioned earlier, what they are doing at the top. Learning to leverage the power of anticipation was a huge takeaway. Lay
Mhm.
that foundation for growth now, like ideally not when you're already growing and your client experience or team experience starting to suffer from it.
Right.
And then another big one was build those relationships with the team and have these crucial conversations. And the way I like to frame that too is, it's attack the problem or the behavior, not the person. And that
Right.
simple idea, but
It's
not
great.
always easiest to execute on. Well,
Great.
that's a wrap for today's episode of the Perpetual Growth Podcast. Mark Scrimenti, thank you so much for your clarity, your wisdom, and the powerful frameworks you brought to the table. If you're listening and you want to learn more about how Mark helps companies simplify, scale, and lead with vision, the best place to reach Mark right now is on LinkedIn. So Mark Scrimenti on LinkedIn, and we'll make sure that we've got links so you don't have to search for him. You can find him in the show notes, but make sure you check out Mark, reach out to him. If you're on the fence, anything from an operational HR perspective, he will be your go-to resource. And conversations are free, so it's a great place to
Yeah.
start. You know,
Th-
um, Go ahead, Mark.
no, thank you. Yeah, and please do. Reach out. I'd love to
Yeah.
talk.
Well, if you got something valuable from today's episode, don't keep it to yourself. Please be sure to share it with somebody on your team or in your network, and leave us a 5-star review so we can reach even more people. Let's keep building businesses don't just grow, but grow on purpose. Until next time, keep expanding, keep evolving, and remember, growth isn't just about what you achieve, it's about who you become along the way.